Welcome, welcome. What a day. What a day. We appreciate everyone who is here in our live audience and those folks that are tuning in at home or at work online, and as well as people who are for sure watching this after the fact, because as people here know, we are competing with what must be the hearing of the century, right? Across town. What a day. But we are here to talk about something timeless and important as well, and that is education. So let's get to it. I am Mike Petrilli. I am president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute and a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, and we appreciate you for joining us here today. It's my honor to welcome you to the first event in what we are calling our Education 2020 speaker series. In a moment, I will introduce our amazing speaker, Heather McDonald. But first, let me spend a few minutes explaining the purpose behind the series and what we're hoping to accomplish with it. And for those of you that are following along on Twitter, we are at hashtag #Ed2020. So please look at that. I will be following along that online conversation myself. The basic idea of Education 2020 is to get an esteemed group of the nation's leading conservative thinkers, scholars, intellectuals, and policymakers to weigh in on the purpose of K-12 education. This is not meant to be the familiar bunch of education policy wonks like myself or my colleague Checker Finn. We get plenty of opportunities to dig into the weeds of education policy at events like this. But that's not the purpose of this event or this series. Instead, we have asked people who think broadly about social policy from a right-of-center perspective to talk about the purpose of K-12 education. And we're very excited that almost everybody we asked, including Heather, said yes. Our goal is to bring fresh insights and timeless principles into the ed reform conversation. We at Fordham tend to believe that today's reform discussion has grown somewhat stale, even a little boring, especially on the right. Now, once upon a time, conservatives were bursting with ideas for how to fix what ails American education. Things like school choice, charter schools, accountability, merit pay, character education, core knowledge, on and on. In Bill Bennett's days, back in the 80s, there were the 3 C's: character, content, and choice. These days, it's more like the 1 C, choice. That's all that most conservatives seem to want to talk about. And like so many people that aren't necessarily conservative, it feels like we're looking for that silver bullet. And it feels like we're becoming a little bit like one-trick ponies. Now, don't misunderstand me. Myself, Checker, those of us at Fordham, certainly our colleagues at Hoover, wholeheartedly support school choice in all of its forms. We're particularly bullish on high-quality charter schools as well as inner-city Catholic schools, both of which have proven to be highly effective at boosting the achievement of low-income kids and kids of color, and demonstrating that it's possible to push back against intergenerational poverty and all the social ills that come with it. And like many conservatives, we tend to look at most big urban districts and agree that nothing except choice appears to be doing anybody much good. So yes to school choice. Where we tend to disagree with some of our friends on the right, especially the libertarian right, is around the notion that choice alone is the answer, that it's the silver bullet. Some libertarians, for example, recently have been pointing to the many culture wars that have invaded our schools, and they argue that choice is the solution. Why should we fight over which curriculum to teach or which heroes to emulate, how to tackle human sexuality or human evolution, whether to be strict or lax, whether to teach virtue or vocation? Instead, just let individual schools find their own way on all of these issues, and then let parents find their own way to a school that matches their values. Don't try to make these decisions democratically, because, of course, then the majority gets what they want, the minority loses out, or we get some kind of compromise that makes nobody happy. Just let the market rule, and everybody will get what they want. And even some non-libertarian conservatives take this approach, especially in the context of a culture that is increasingly at war with conservative values. In effect, going for the Benedict option, if you've read that book, retreating into our own educational communities, often religious schools, protecting our kids from the culture at large, with the reasoning that the culture is so hopeless, we need to isolate ourselves and our kids from it. Now, again, we support parents who want to make this choice. Okay, it is an understandable choice for parents to make, but it is not a silver bullet for our education system as a whole. Certainly not anytime soon in our lifetimes or the lifetimes of our kids or grandkids. Even with the huge growth of school choice in recent years, the vast majority of American school children attend traditional public schools, something like 40 million kids. And if conservatives do not engage on debates around what these children do and learn all day, we are ceding the public schools and the country's future to progressives. And we did that already with higher education. I want to repeat that again because this is something that I know Heather McDonald has written a lot about higher education and the ideology that's really driving the conversation on campuses. We could argue that conservatives gave up on debating, being a part of that debate on academia. We do not want to make that same mistake again when it comes to public education. The topic that Heather is tackling today is a perfect example of the risks of that approach. School discipline's a very difficult issue because it pits the needs of the vast majority of children who come to school and do what they're told and generally behave against the needs of a small minority of disruptive students, many of whom grew up themselves in tragic situations. Yet if we cede this issue to the left, virtually the only students who will be valued are the disruptors, the misbehaviors. As Heather will argue, virtually the entire focus of the left when it comes to so-called discipline reform is less discipline, which may or may not help the unruly kids. I think she's going to talk about that, but almost surely, at least likely, will not help their peers. So if conservatives decline to engage, we do so at great peril. So over this year, this academic year, about once a month, we'll be here with leading conservatives to engage in the great debates and to focus on the purpose of K-12 schooling. We do hope you'll join us for those. We won't always be competing against a Supreme Court hearing. And at the end, we're going to turn the keynotes into an edited volume to be published by the Templeton Press. We're excited about that. We appreciate the folks at the Curran Family Foundation for making this all possible. Whew. Okay, now finally, without further ado, to launch our series, let me introduce today's speaker, Heather McDonald. Heather is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of City Journal and a New York Times bestselling author. She's written for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, New Republic, and the New Criterion. Her newest book, which is in the lobby, available for sale, is The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. And it argues that the toxic ideas first spread by higher education have undermined humanistic values, fueled intolerance, and widened divisions in our larger culture. In another recent book, which was the New York Times bestseller, The War on Cops, she warned that race-based attacks on the criminal justice system are eroding the authority of law and putting lives at risk. She's a frequent guest on Fox and CNN and other TV. She holds a BA in English from Yale, law degree from Stanford, and has received numerous accolades, including the 2005 Bradley Prize. So we're so fortunate to have her with us today to kick off Education 2020 with her talk on school discipline. Please join me in welcoming Heather McDonald.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for that gracious introduction. I've heard it rumored that Washington is a political town. I don't know where anybody got that idea, but the fact that there's actually an audience in here shows that it's also a town of ideas and interest in broader social change. So I appreciate you tearing yourselves away from the TV screen and the voyeurism of seeing what's going to happen with our future court and being willing to engage a broader discussion that will be with us, sadly, I think, for a long time. Let me place some context in what's been going on in the schools recently, something broader than that. Let's look at Chicago, where juvenile crime has been spiking. Carjackings have nearly tripled since 2015, and the share of juveniles committing them has grown from 35% in 2016 to 60% in the first 5 months of 2018. This surge in juvenile carjackings is the result of a change in the criminal law that eliminated the automatic transfer of young carjackers to adult court. The Cook County's chief juvenile court judge reported, quote, "The kids have become enlightened to the lack of consequences." Meanwhile, in downtown Chicago, youth mobs have been running riot. Large groups of teens regularly swarm across major intersections, jumping on the tops of cars caught in the stampede. Over the 2018 Memorial Day weekend, teens ran down Michigan Avenue punching people and vandalizing stores. A group of 8 to 10 boys knocked a 15-year-old boy to the ground, then stomped on his head and kicked his ribs, back, and face before emptying his pockets and stealing his shoes. The police made almost no arrests during the melee, preferring to avoid confrontation. The city is lost, a federal prosecutor told me. We have never had crimes like this in the downtown area. People getting shoved and robbed at 3 p.m. It's brazen. This prosecutor has started avoiding the Magnificent Mile on Saturday afternoons. I'm scared to go downtown, she told me. A Chicago police detective with 24 years on the job observed, quote, "This generation of kids has grown up with no one daring to touch them." The New Orleans district attorney reports a similar breakdown of social control in his city. Kids are terrorizing New Orleans, the DA told me. There's a lot of pressure not to incarcerate, but there has got to be accountability, he said. Without that, they become brazened, hardened individuals. The lowered sanctions on juvenile criminals in Chicago, New Orleans, and elsewhere belongs to a wider push to reduce criminal penalties across the board. For the last 5 years, activists and academics have pressured legislatures into lessening the sanctions on criminal behavior or decriminalizing it altogether. A parallel process of desanctioning has been underway in the schools to the same effect. A rise in disruptive and antisocial behavior. And a driving force in all these changes, whether in the education or criminal justice systems, has been the concept of disparate impact. Any law enforcement or school disciplinary practice that disproportionately affects blacks and Hispanics is deemed racist. A vast majority of teen carjackers and robbers in Chicago, New Orleans, and other big cities is black, as is the majority of adult violent street criminals, and as is a majority of their victims, which is who we should be caring about. As far as crime commission goes, blacks, for example, commit homicide in this country at 8 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. Laws penalizing those behaviors, therefore, will inevitably disproportionately affect blacks and to a lesser extent Hispanics. According to the proponents of disparate impact analysis, however, the problem lies not with the behaviors that trigger that disparate impact, but with the laws and penalties themselves. By virtue of having disparate impact, they reflect bias and should be changed or eliminated. Disparate impact analysis is more consequential in schools than in the area of criminal justice, since schools are the last opportunity to correct an individual's antisocial behavior before he enters society as an adult. Academics like UCLA's Dan Lozin have argued for years that school disciplinary practices are racist because black and Hispanic students are disproportionately suspended and expelled. Nationally, black students are suspended at nearly 3 times the rate of white students. Lozin and his fellow anti-discipline researchers take such disparities as prima facie evidence of teacher and principal bias against so-called students of color. Asians, by the way, don't count as students of color because they are academically successful. Higher suspension rates for minority students are said to create a, quote, school-to-prison pipeline. Suspended or expelled minority students have little choice but to become involved in street crime, it is argued, thus increasing their chances of ending up in prison. The school-to-prison pipeline conceit reverses cause and effect, however. It is the same lack of self-control that leads violent and disruptive students to be removed from class that also results in higher rates of crime and imprisonment. But suggesting that disparate disciplinary rates reflect different rates of school misbehavior has been taboo. It is simply assumed that black, Hispanic, white, and Asian students all behave identically in class, but are treated differently by teachers and principals because of their race and ethnicity. All available evidence, however, points to the existence of large disparities in conduct. According to federal data, for example, black male teenagers between the ages of 14 and 17 commit homicide at nearly 10 times the rate of white male teenagers of the same age. The category white in this homicide data includes most Hispanics. If Hispanics were removed from the white category, the homicide disparity between black and white male teens would be much higher. That higher black homicide rate indicates a failure of socialization. Teen murderers of any race lack impulse control and anger management skills. It is fanciful to think that the lack of socialization that produces such elevated rates of criminal violence would not also affect classroom behavior. In the 2018 Indicators of School Crime and Safety report produced by the U.S. Justice and Education Departments, black students self-reported being in a physical fight at school at over twice the rate of white students. Schools that were 50% minority or more reported weekly gang activity at nearly 10 times the rate of schools where minorities constituted 5% to 20% of the population. Reports of gang violence in schools with less than 5% minority populations were too low to be usable statistically. These and other data support the conclusion that so-called students of color act out more than white and Asian students. White students are also disciplined far more than Asian students, and boys far more than girls. The race activists have never accused schools of anti-white and anti-male bias, however, apparently accepting that Asian students and girls possess more impulse control and show more respect for authority than white students and boys. Teacher reports confirm these data. In a forthcoming book, Sit Down and Shut Up, How Discipline Can Set Students Free, Chinque Henderson, a black substitute teacher who worked in Los Angeles' inner city schools, describes the flight of teachers from urban schools because of students' quote, chaotic, unchecked behavior. That behavior, which includes assaults on teachers, cursing, and defiant insubordination, may be the biggest problem facing teachers, he writes. In 2011, the U.S. Commission for Civil Rights held hearings on school discipline. These too confirmed behavioral disparities. Teachers from urban districts described a range of violent and highly disruptive student conduct. A high school English teacher in Alexandria, Virginia, no longer tries to intervene in fights between black girls, he told the commission. We've had staff members injured separating them. There's an anger in those girls where there's no fathers in the home that is almost unbelievable. Academic bias researchers complain that black students are punished more often for so-called subjective offenses. These allegedly bias-inviting subjective infractions include defiance, disobedience, and classroom disruption, as opposed to, say, the objective offense of smoking. This objective versus subjective distinction is ad hoc and largely factitious. And given black family breakdown with the attendant loss of child socialization, it is predictable that black students would be more prone to insubordination and classroom disruption. 71% of black children are born to single mothers, 3 times the percentage of white children. Another witness at the 2011 Civil Rights Commission hearing described some of the subjective offenses that urban teachers routinely encounter: calling out, engaging in conversation across the room, exchanging insults, use of obscenity, insulting the teacher, wandering around the classroom, touching other students. It is absurd to suggest that such behavior, which prevents the majority of law-abiding, disciplined students from learning, is less serious than smoking. In any case, objective metrics of problem behavior show similar racial disparities. The rate of chronic truancy, defined as 18 or more unexcused absences a year, is 5 times higher for black elementary school students in California than for white students. Such truancy grows out of the same chaotic home environments that produce classroom disobedience. Nevertheless, school districts across the country have been radically reducing punishments for serious student behavior in the name of social justice. Restorative justice circles and yoga have replaced out-of-school suspensions and expulsions. School districts have hired costly school climate transformation directors and equity overseers. The results have been the same as in the criminal justice system. Not greater justice, but greater chaos. Students know that the rules have changed and that there are no longer any consequences for their behavior. Chinque Henderson told two 13-year-old girls to go to the principal's office for insubordinate behavior. They refused. After 10 minutes of defiance and the ineffective intercession of a campus aide, one girl finally said, "Come on, let's go. Nothing's going to happen to us anyway." She was right. In Des Moines, teachers started leaving after the school district demanded that disruptive students be kept in the classroom in 2016. Students hit teachers and other students with little consequence. A 9-year-old boy was repeatedly struck by a fellow student, but the teacher felt powerless to do anything lest she be accused of discriminating against a minority student. In 2018, a cell phone video captured a classroom assault emblematic of the post-disciplinary era. A physics teacher in Texas had dared to confiscate a student's smartphone after repeated requests to put it away. "Give me my fucking phone. This is the last time asking your stupid ass," the teen yelled, towering over the teacher, sitting frozen behind his desk, the very image of cowering submission. The student aggressively swept the papers on the teacher's desk to the floor, then violently shoved him in the face. Still impassive, the teacher silently pushed the phone across the desk back to the student, who grabbed it with a self-righteous shrug and strode away. The school principal explained that it was, quote, "just a bad day the student was having," and commended the teacher's passive response. Chinque Henderson tells of a student who shoves a pregnant teacher in order to grab her laptop and watch a video. The dean then interrogated the teacher about why the student was not, quote, "jibing with her." The district attorney in St. Paul called the rise in attacks on teachers a public health crisis. Students' assaults in Durham increased more than 50% in 2017. And education predictably suffered as well. Wisconsin schools that adopted non-punitive disciplinary measures had lower reading and math achievement than schools that stuck with traditional discipline. Henderson calls a tolerance for cursing at teachers the broken windows of public education. Evidence of a collapsed school environment ruled by emotional chaos, where test scores are invariably rock bottom. The desanctioning movement was already well underway before 2014, when a guidance from the Obama Education Department threatened schools with litigation and the loss of federal funding if they did not bring down Black and Hispanic disciplinary rates to the same levels as whites and Asians. But the 2014 guidance strengthened the clout of pricey equity consultants and anti-racism activists who redoubled the pressure on school district leaders and principals to not remove Black and Hispanic students from class for serious misbehavior. Trump Education Secretary Betsy DeVos will likely rescind the Obama guidance on school discipline. But K through 12 education has become so permeated by identity politics and racial victimology that many districts will undoubtedly continue with their desanctioning policies anyway. Pace the race advocates, it is this new state of affairs that constitutes an actual school-to-prison pipeline. Schools are actually usually the last chance to civilize children if their family has failed to do so. Schools accomplish that civilizing mission through the application of a colorblind behavioral code, neutrally enforced, that communicates to students that their behavioral choices have consequences. Students learn that society will hold them responsible for their actions. If instead a school tolerates disruptive impulses and worse, conveys that race is an excuse for bad behavior, that school not only does not arrest antisocial criminogenic tendency, it contributes to it. The teen carjackers in Chicago and rampaging youth in New Orleans likely faced little punishment in school before encountering that same lack of punishment from the criminal justice system. A teacher from Miami-Dade County told Chinque Henderson, quote, It is virtually impossible to discipline a student. I know we are losing a generation of kids of color as a result of allowing them to run wild. Excusing insubordination and aggression in the name of racial equity is not a civil rights accomplishment. The third-party victims of such behavior are themselves disproportionately minority, whether fellow classmates who cannot learn, who want to come to school and learn and are being denied that opportunity by disruptive students, a civil rights violation for them, or law-abiding residents of high-crime neighborhoods, the many bourgeois citizens who I've talked to over the years who have to worry about taking their children safely to school without being carjacked or caught in a drive-by shooting. But the alleged beneficiary of a racial double standard in conduct, the student who is exempted from strict discipline, is also a victim, since he will be handicapped in life by his failure to learn self-restraint and respect for authority. This swerve away from self-help and personal responsibility on the part of some race activists betrays the august traditions of black leadership, embodied by Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Martin Luther King Jr., all of whom celebrated bourgeois values of comportment and high standards of achievement, while calling on America to finally, belatedly, live up to its promise of equality before the law. They would likely have regarded the disparate impact conceit and other excuses for misbehavior with disdain. Tragically, no progress in stemming the social catastrophe of family breakdown has been made since 1965, when Daniel Patrick Moynihan foresaw that the march towards full racial equality would stall unless the practice of marriage returned to the black community and, frankly, now to America across the board. But double standards in behavior and achievement only perpetuate the racial divide rather than help close it. The highest mission of education is to pass on knowledge of a culture's greatest accomplishments and to develop in students gratitude for the beauty that has been bequeathed to them by past generations. But that transmission of culture can only occur if students first learn to civilize themselves. Conservatives must be vocal in combating the myth of teacher bias and be willing to speak honestly about the misbehavior that leads to disparate student discipline rates. As long as the left holds the field, as long as it enforces a code of silence about what's going on in inner city schools, it's going to be impossible to push back against this highly destructive practice. Conservatives need to trumpet as they do, but they could do so even more so, the accomplishments of the so-called no excuses school like KIPP, Success Academy, that insist on a colorblind, strict behavioral code. But even more importantly, they have to recover the language of bourgeois virtue and talk about the importance for the values of self-discipline, deferred gratification, that help all civilizations succeed, that must be expected within schools, that are rightly expected of students, and that all students can achieve if we only treat them with respect and stop making excuses for bad behavior. That is a recipe for social division and educational failure. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you so much for that, Heather. I think as our audience can see, you do not hold back.
I'm sorry, I refuse to.
And that is clarifying. I mean, I think I'm sure there are people here who disagree strongly with you, or people watching online who disagree strongly, but it is so hard to have straightforward and honest conversations about some of these issues, and so it's refreshing to have you come right out. But let me push back a little bit on some things while also having some conversation about some of the issues that you raised. And let me start kind of big picture in the place of principles and ideals, and then we'll get kind of more pragmatic as we go. What you used language that I think for a lot of us feels a little bit shocking because we don't use this language very often anymore. Talking about how we need to socialize children, right? How we need to civilize children. How we need to, and we have this history in this country, and certainly in education, still very much strong on education schools, about romanticism. This idea from Rousseau, even before that, that humans are born these wonderful creatures, and that it is society and civilization that beats them down, and if we could only unleash the noble savage within each of us, or I'm sure I'm butchering this, but this notion that kids are born good, and we should just let their sort of free spirit out. That is the goal of education. And you are expressing something that is a traditionally conservative view, going way back to Burke and further back than that.
Plato.
That says no. Our human nature is actually quite dark. We are animals. We are tribal. We are violent, and that we have to civilize and socialize young people. So I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about sort of how do we make sense of this? If we can agree on that, on sort of do kids need to be socialized or civilized or not? How do we make progress in all the rest of this stuff? As you think about all these issues, how do you kind of help people understand this perspective that it's not just a matter of letting kids be free to be you and me kind of thing?
Mm-hmm. Well, the missing plank in the conservative education agenda up to now has been blowing up the ed schools. We're really not going to accomplish much as long as ed schools remain the predominant means of credentializing teachers. They are in the grip, as you say, Michael, of a highly fictional ideology about human nature, and the idea that children do not need induction into habits of self-control and to respect for others, that they are naturally good. I'm not saying they're naturally evil. They're just naturally egotistical, and will, left unwatched, will not have the control over their impulses. This is not certainly a race issue. This is true for all children. Aristotle was very adamant that virtue comes through the inculcation of habit. It is not some enlightened moment of revelation. It is through society, parents, developing in young children the habits of treating people with respect, of being honest, of being courageous. This requires structure. If I can put in another dig at ed schools, obviously besides the fantasy idea of human nature that they are putting out into the world, and a obsessive identity politics, is the progressive idea of student-centered learning, and that teachers should merely be facilitators, that students should discover their own knowledge. There should not be a pipeline, a transmission of knowledge from the teacher to the student. I would say, again, this is absurd. Students come to school ignorant. They're too ignorant, really, to, especially in K through 12, to know how to teach each other. We need a sense of intellectual authority. Knowledge is something hard won. And I hate to say it, this is, well, I don't hate, but this goes against the prevailing wisdom. It includes facts. It includes hard data. It includes the facts of cell division, of meiosis and mitosis, the Krebs cycle, photosynthesis, the periodic table, the facts of the spread of civilization throughout the early Mediterranean, the facts of the hard-won development of due process within the Anglo-American tradition. Those are not things that students are going to bubble up themselves. It's things that teachers should possess, if only ed schools were guaranteeing that the teachers actually had knowledge themselves, and pass on.
Okay. And I have to say, when I went through ed school myself to get a teaching certificate, and I look back on those times and I think, boy, I would have been much better off if I'd become a parent first before going through that experience, because then I would have thought to myself, oh my God, I've experienced being around a toddler, for example, and I can tell you those times they need to be civilized, right? These things come out of the ether, and they need our guidance. But let me push on this, because look, the language that you use, you understand that some people can hear it and it sounds racialized to them, right? If we talk about kids running wild, that there are people on, there are the horrific alt-right people who will use that kind of imagery to try to paint that picture of African Americans or kids of color. And that's not what you're saying. What you're saying is that any child who would grow up in an environment where they're not getting what they need, especially when they're very young, are not getting the socialization, they're not getting that, what were the other words? Being civilized in the same way, right? There's not a race thing. And yet you look around and you talk about bourgeois values, it's not like all these white parents out there in America today are super traditionalists when it comes to raising their kids, right? I mean, they often have these very kind of warm and fuzzy approaches too. So how do we explain that if you go into Bethesda, you don't see a bunch of kids, having huge discipline problems and acting out? What's going on?
Fathers, I think that children, ideally, on average, and I know that there are many heroic, courageous single mothers that are working against the odds and achieving and succeeding. But social science, which is a pretty left-wing field, has been pretty unanimous now for decades that children who grow up in a single-parent home are at much higher risk of juvenile delinquency, mental, emotional problems, crime, getting pregnant as a teen for girls. Men and women are different on average. Fathers bring different skills to parents. The feminist ideology that has taken over our society holds that strong women can do it all. And we are disappearing men from the public arena and from public discourse. And to talk about fathers is seen as somehow a strike against feminist empowerment. Right. And I refuse to take that bait. If nothing else, children with two parents at home have twice the economic resources. Not that I think that the controlling issue here is money at home. I don't. They have twice the kinship resources to draw on when one parent is at his wit's end with the screaming toddler. And they have a complementarity of traits, especially boys, to be able to help children become adults. Cinque Henderson talks about the moment when a son becomes larger than his mother. And now maybe that mother has been so strict and is so in control that that's not going to tip the scales of power in the household, but it can, and it becomes harder at that point for the mother to exercise the civilizing influence that a father could.
So those of us that work in education, we have these debates all the time. What can we do in schools given all these challenges outside of schools? And people on the left would argue that maybe schools are doing all they can, or some people on the left make that case. Some of us on the right talk about these issues of family breakdown. But whatever it is, kids come into schools, and many of them haven't gotten what they need. All right, so now you have kids, let's say in elementary school, let's say they haven't gotten that socializing and civilizing at home for a variety of reasons. This is, again, white, black, Hispanic, right, rural, urban. They come into school and they don't have it. Is it fair to expect schools to be able to do this? Can schools, is it hopeless? What can schools do for those young people that still need that kind of socialization?
Well, the left hates the no excuses schools. These are schools that try to script every student action from the moment he steps into the school hallways. And if you're one of the naive Rousseauian progressives, you look at this and you think this is horrifying. It's like a penitentiary. We're like not giving them any creativity to express themselves. But this was developed out of observation that children at home are often not learning those instincts of self-control, of obeying rules, of being orderly. And so it helps to develop a script. Again, it's the Aristotelian cultivation of habit, of following certain rules, being quiet in school, paying attention to the teacher. The teacher, too, follows certain rules. These no excuses schools, the teacher follows a very strict script of how to do classroom management, probably because the people who run these schools know that if the teachers have come out of progressive ed, they're going to be less likely to follow a top-down transmission of knowledge model. So there's some kids that may not be corrigible, but I think that on average we have not tried hard enough. And you know, at the turn of the 20th century, there were people coming to this country who also came out of very difficult backgrounds. The schools then were unapologetic about saying we're going to assimilate people into our culture. Right. Teachers did not make excuses. And that's the biggest act of faith you can have for a student, to say, I'm not going to make an excuse for you, whether it's on the basis of poverty or race. I'm going to believe that you have within you the capacity to live up to the same standards that everybody else does.
Right, because otherwise it's the soft bigotry of low expectations that we heard about so much 20 years ago. And that, again, I feel like many education reform folks on the left still embrace when it comes to high expectations around academics and around instruction and what kids can...
They
and
do?
Yet that
they
doesn't,
embrace that?
Well, yes, but not, well, I mean, many of the people who run these schools that you're talking about, who
right,
are themselves,
that's right.
progressives.
You're right.
They're a minority, and in the education reform movement, but that's when it comes to academics. And there's been a big pushback in recent years about behavior, that somehow when it's behavior, it's different. Now, let's keep going. So you've got these younger kids come in, and we're trying to figure out how to help them. And you look at a little 5-year-old or a 6-year-old coming out of, again, horrific circumstances at home or in the community, obviously not their fault that they didn't get what they needed or that they got exposed to lead poisoning or that all kinds of things. And yet at some point in your talk, it sounds like as these kids get older, let's say they're now teenagers, and let's say that they are now getting into serious trouble, in school, out of school, they are edging towards violence, that they become the perpetrators. But they're still children. They're still not 18. I mean, some people would say you're blaming the victim. These kids are victims. They're victims of horrific circumstances. How do we think this through, Heather? Like, how do we... because right now the whole mindset is we need to do whatever we can to help those kids. And you're saying that at some point we need to protect their peers from their behavior. How do we make sense of that?
Well, I don't think it's mutually exclusive at all. You're helping their peers by, if they're being disruptive and are preventing students from learning, you're helping the peers by removing them from class. You're helping the child who is acting out by saying there are consequences for your behavior. It's a completely antisocial creed to say that there are no consequences for behavior. At some point in society, despite the pervasiveness of the disparate impact conceit, and I would hope that, I'm not making a plug here for the Trump administration either way, but with the time remaining and who knows how long that is, it should summon all its regulatory might to try and extirpate disparate impact rules from the Code of Federal Regulations to the extent possible. But in any case, you are not helping those students by saying your poverty or your race or anything else should excuse you for consequences, because at some point you're likely going to meet a consequence.
Okay, but some people will say, the discipline reform crowd will say, it's not working. We suspend them or we expel them, and it doesn't work. They're not, it doesn't get them, it does not scared straight and they get their life together and they come back to be good students. They continue down a road of failing out of school, and this, again, the school to prison pipeline, right? So they say, let's try something else that might be more effective for those kids. Let's have a more therapeutic, think about having social workers come in and try to work with those kids instead of treating it as needing to be penalized. I mean, do you buy that?
You know, I may be influenced by the big city school districts that I've encountered. There's no paucity of social workers.
Yeah.
I don't think this is a solution that has not been tried. I mean, there is a metastasizing bureaucracy in schools of aides, social workers, a therapeutic approach.
Right.
The fact is, it sure looks like with the anti-disciplinary credo taking deeper root and wider root, that school disorder is increasing. It doesn't seem to be working. Again, this book that I mentioned, he talks about a school district. I was probably in Minnesota. They've been doing so much. There's been so much controversy there about their equity agenda. But the district trumpeted data that allegedly showed that the anti-discipline practices were successful. And Henderson talked to teachers there. He said, this is a hoax. This is an outright hoax. They are concealing the data. They are concealing the lived experience of students and teachers.
Right, right. All right, one last question, then we'll get the audience in here, either here or on Twitter. Again, hashtag #Ed2020 if you've got a question. So you've addressed this issue now with school discipline. You've addressed this issue with police shootings and you have said that the disparate impact claims are not correct. That's not the same thing as saying that there is not some racism and bias in the system, right? I mean, would you agree that surely there are some places where kids are being treated differently because of their race? I mean, how do we handle the likelihood in a big country like ours that some of that is going on somewhere, and how do we root that out?
Well,
or tell me if you think it's not true. I mean, push back.
There may be places in the deep South where teachers are benighted and bigoted and hateful and are imposing different disciplinary codes and are trigger happy when it comes to black student misbehavior. All I know is that teacher ed schools are one long marinade in social justice. And instead of teaching teachers core knowledge, as E.D. Hirsch has recommended, instead of teaching them strategies for dealing with students acting out, they focus overwhelmingly on white privilege theory, on multiculturalism. Teachers are among the most liberal, progressive occupations in the country, if not the most. I mean, maybe social workers are more so. But to think that there is a systemic problem of racism, because that's what we're talking about, is systemic. What should we be doing en masse? And who knows that there's not some anti-white racism. I mean, as a general matter in society, I can tell you, there is anti-white racism. I've experienced it. I've spent a lot of time in Harlem. It's there's closed minds everywhere. But I think maybe we should take a experimental hiatus for 5 years and stop focusing on racism and start looking at behavior, because the behavioral disparities are in fact so great. If blacks acted like Asians, and whites acted like Asians for that matter, for 10 years, with the same fanatical home culture, dedicated to educational accomplishment, with parents riding their kids relentlessly to study, to take their books home, to achieve, to avoid gangs, avoid hanging on the corner, and we still saw the disparities that we saw, then it would be long past time to talk about systemic racism as the explanation for our world. But right now, there are very defined behavioral disparities, whether it's out-of-wedlock birth rate, the anti-white syndrome culture, school truancy, that need to be addressed. And the racism discourse is a way of not talking about behavior and bourgeois norms.
Okay, let's get some conversation in here from the audience. We're going to start with Bill Evers of Hoover. We got a microphone coming for the benefit of folks watching at home.
So I wanted to ask you three kind of interrelated things, and one is
Start with one.
one is
you.
how much in your book are you discussing this, and how much your new book, and then
Well,
related.
thank you
Let's
for
start with
that question.
Yeah, good plug. We'll start with that, and then we'll get the other ones, Bill.
Okay.
The book definitely describes the very poisonous identity politics, which is based on the idea that American schools, whether it's college campuses or K through 12, are pervaded by systemic sexism and racism, and the transmission belt that takes that fantastical, delusional claim about, above all, American college campuses and puts it into the world at large. It is threatening meritocracy. The so-called STEM fields, these are the science, technology, engineering, and math fields, are under relentless pressure from the federal government and from the own internal diversity enforcers on college campuses to jettison colorblind and gender-blind meritocratic science standards in favor of gender and race quotas in hiring for science teaching. A cancer, an oncologist researcher at an Ivy League medical school was berated by his supervisor for giving an exam in pharmacology that was allegedly too, quote, fact-based, because testing for facts was seen as having a disparate impact on females in science and minorities. Now, I don't know about you, but if I've got cancer, I want my doctor to know the facts of drug interaction. So the book definitely takes on the problem. It has a chapter on implicit bias, which is another phony conceit. It looks at the totally specious social science methodology that underlies the implicit bias conceit, which has now taken over the corporate world and the academic world.
And it's an industry, because the people who put the seminars on and so forth are making
at the bit.
zillions.
They're making zillions, and taxpayers are paying when it comes to higher ed. Taxpayers, the tuition keeps on going up because the diversity bureaucracy, because faculty searches, they're mandated to do implicit bias training, and we wonder why tuition is going up. It's because of the diversity bureaucracy and the implicit bias bureaucracy.
So on this particular topic tonight, though, this Chenke Henderson's new book, Sit Down and Shut Up, is on that specifically, on the school discipline
K through 12.
problem.
It's on K through 12.
Okay, so related to this is the question of what exactly the people on the other side are proposing. I'll give you an example that I heard of. In a school, discipline records start anew every day. In other words, one doesn't take account of previous misbehavior during the school year or in a previous year. Every day is a new day in that school. So do you have thoughts on some of these ideas that are out there concretely that trouble you, that you've heard
It's
of?
very interesting. There's a criminologist at University of Cincinnati named John Paul Wright, and he looks at issues of disparate impact in education. He did a regression analysis type study that showed that students' discipline at rates at time 2 were fully predicted by their disciplinary history at time 1. And he submitted this. So in other words, it's a behavioral pattern. Again, it's not
it's
race.
the inverse of the Aristotelian habit of right conduct. If you facilitate habits of wrong conduct, you're going to continue to get it.
Exactly. So he said, if you control for that, the race element disappears. He submitted his research to about 14 different journals of education, and they all rejected it. They said this work is an assault on our social justice mission. The education has been taken over not by an educational mission, but by a social justice mission. He ended up publishing it in a criminology journal. Now, criminology is hardly a conservative field, but he got a hearing there. So it's very interesting to hear this. It's something I didn't know, but it is a way of making sure that the John Paul Wrights of the world don't have that data to push back against this conceit of racist teachers.
So the last part of this trilogy it's also related, but it's what in particular, other than the implicit quota thing that's in the guidance, the school discipline guidance of the Obama administration in 2014, were there other particular things that are in there that are driving us in a counterproductive direction?
Well, I'm going to reveal my nature here, which is not so much a policy wonk. I think there's sort of what I call policy porn, the belief that if you can just get the regs right, you change the world. I tend to focus more on culture and ideas. My boss feels differently, and it would be nice if, we could just write different regulations and things would change. I think, as I say, even if the Obama guidance on school discipline is extirpated root and branch, I'm not sure it's going to have as large an effect as one might hope for, because I think by now schools are really conquered by this thinking. So, Michael and Chester had asked me, are there solutions? Should we have the federal government, for instance, outlaw state laws that are infused by the disparate impact outlook? And that, frankly, is outside my regulatory knowledge. I'm somewhat loath to say we need more federal involvement in state matters. And I don't quite know how you would define that or how you'd...
Heather, I appreciate the non-policy wonk in you, which is great. My character tends to be looking for a compromise. How do we bring people along? I guess I'm just a big squish, as Bill will tell you. Yes. This seems like one of these areas where it doesn't have to be as divisive as it is. We did a poll at Education Next. We've done it twice now, asking people what do they think about making these discipline decisions based on race or worrying about the disparate impact. I forget how exactly we phrased it. We tried to do it in as neutral a way as possible, and it was overwhelmingly unpopular, including among African American parents and Latino parents. Nobody wants racial quotas for discipline. People fundamentally get that. And yet we see it seems to be marching across the land. And so how do we get school board members, how do we get parents, conservatives, liberals, white, black, Hispanic, how do we get people to get active on this? And is there any way, I guess I think about how this has played out in the criminal justice world, the Black Lives Matter movement and all of this kind of stuff, which again, pits this question about how do we get the balance right between protecting the vast majority of people who are innocent and being victimized versus people who commit crimes? And is there common ground here, or is this just going to be an ideological war that conservatives need to win?
Yeah, I think we have to win it. I think conservatives have been making compromises for a long time, and they have censored themselves in talking about behavior. The public is largely ignorant about the disparities in criminal victimization. It's just amazing to me, the racism of the press. There were 4,300 people shot in Chicago in 2016. That's one person every 2 hours. Those victims were overwhelmingly black. The press looked away. Imagine if 4,300 white people, white Chicagoans, had been shot in Chicago in 1 year. One white Chicagoan every 2 hours. There would be a national revolution. And yet when Trump talked about the carnage in Chicago, he was called a racist, because you're not allowed to talk about black victims who are the overwhelming majority of crime victims in this country, because doing so might risk talking about criminals. So I think conservatives have been holding their self-censoring. They themselves probably don't know the facts, because it has been so canceled. So the middle ground, I mean, we have been talking social justice. We've been talking don't blame the victim for decades. What more middle ground is there that conservatives have not occupied?
So if you're talking, let's forget about the federal government, but you're talking to a local school board member, okay, which we still have this system of local control in this country. We think conservatives all over the country on local school boards. Let's imagine that their district, they start to figure out, is doing this kind of stuff. What do you encourage them to do? What should they ask about? What are some of the questions they might ask?
Well, I'm always curious as to why teachers are more or less tongue-tied. And like Teach for America students, now that's becoming a more and more left-wing, I think it always was, a left-wing organization. You know, a lot of their training is all in the social justice stuff before they enter the classroom. But it gets harder and harder to come into the class. I once, in the 90s, I went into, I think it was called Park West High School on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I got in, and it was just astounding what I observed. I mean, students sitting with their backs to the teacher, listening to their iPhones, not paying attention. This was just normal. Schools have gotten smart. They won't let reporters in. But the Teach for America cadre, they've seen it. And I'm just surprised there aren't more books that have come out describing this. Whether teachers that are still in the job are somehow worried, but it has been in a few places the teachers' unions that have stood up for their teachers and saying, we're getting assaulted. We cannot allow this to continue going forward. But I think, there's a great teacher in St. Paul, Minnesota, who I've written about, Aaron Ben, who's black, and he stood up against the bureaucracy and said, if I don't discipline these kids, we're looking at future rapists. They are not learning self-discipline. But he eventually left and is now teaching at a Catholic school. Somehow we need to incentivize more teachers to speak out about this.
Yeah, no, and it is interesting, this possibility of having there be some coalition between conservatives and the teachers' unions on this issue. Right now in Akron, Ohio, there's a debate raging about this, and it's the teachers' union that's saying, look, we are getting victimized, and you're not doing enough to help us.
Right. I think conservatives can lay off the demonization of teacher unions for a bit. I think that's kind of a dead end. I think, again, to assume that teachers without the backing of rules in the school can do it all is wrong. And I think that is as much of a dead end as the endless harping on school choice is the only solution.
Well, that is a perfect way for us to end this event. Please join me in thanking Heather for her courageous and clear comments today.
Appreciate it.